Good morning, everyone. I'm Bryan Simmons. I'm Vice President of Communications at the Arcus Foundation. We're working every day to promote respect for diversity among people and throughout the natural world. If you'd like to read more about us or about the transgender initiative that we announced 2 days ago with the Novo Foundation, visit us at arcusfoundation.org. We're delighted to underwrite this event and to share this brief moment with you this morning. It has been quite a year. I think some might say that LGBTQ people in the United States right now are standing on what the lesbian feminist poet Adrienne Rich called the first page of the end of despair. And some in the movement have certainly been thinking of it that way. About a year ago, Arcus, Haas Jr. Foundation, Ford Foundation, a number of other funders, and frontline organizations, many of whom are represented on today's agenda, got together to discuss a concern that we might forget the lessons learned from Brown versus Board of Education or from the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and forget that decades can pass before legislation and advances in the abstract become concrete in the day-to-day lives of people. We really wanted to understand what was on the minds of people, LGBTQ people in our country, how they thought we should be moving forward and what really made a difference for them. We also had a concern about the direction of the movement being determined by an elite circle of folks who actually had assets to protect with marriage equality. So we actually turned to Hattaway Communications to help us with this last year after a short 7-day pilot that Arcus did with the Institute for the Future. We engaged Hattaway, who are here in Washington, to help us put together a sustained national conversation on this topic. Hattaway has, for more than 20 years, worked with a lot of LGBTQ organizations, both at the national and state level, and they've proven a great partner for this project. With us on stage are Doug Hattaway, President of Hattaway Communications, and Nicholle Manners, who director at Hattaway, who was the lead researcher on this project. And we thought it would be interesting for all of you to hear directly from the people who actually did the work. So as the clock ticks down, let's move right along. And I'm going to ask you first, can we just talk about the methods? We wanted to hear from a wider group of people. How did you go about helping us get beyond the New York, San Francisco, Washington axis?
Yes, we were asked to help create a conversation that included people from all walks of life all over the country. So naturally, we started with digital on social media and had a campaign website. The campaign was called Our Tomorrow, the website shareourtomorrow.org. If you're interested, it's still there, and you can learn a lot by going there, what's on the minds of the people who participated in this conversation. But interestingly, most of our responses came offline. We canvassed people in 40 cities across the country, and we partnered with 140 organizations who brought people together and asked them 3 open-ended questions. We said, what are your hopes for your life? And what are your fears about the future? And what ideas do you have for the movement? And that was it. We wanted to hear people's hopes, fears, and ideas. And in 4 months of running the campaign, we got over 15,000 hopes, fears, and ideas from about 5,500 people in all 50 states. And we were also successful in representing the diversity of the community. We have people told us, they voluntarily, and it was all anonymous, but they could tell us their race, ethnicity, identity, gender identity, sexual orientation, lots of demographic information like that. And we got at least 500 responses from most of those groups. So it's a nice sample. If you're interested in learning what's on people's minds and getting a nice representation of what people are thinking about overall and among different groups, I think you'll be interested in this. And another piece of the work, Nicholle and her team did what we call a meta-analysis, where you gather a lot of studies that have already been done. Nicholle will say more about that, to find out what they say. And that information is also on that website. So today, Nicholle and her team are actually now analyzing all of those responses we got. As you can imagine, that takes some time. But we have a little bit of a sneak preview of some few highlights today.
I've seen some of the raw synthesis of those data, and it reads to me like a debunking of a number of myths, and this has come up earlier today, about the LGBTQ community. Can you talk a little bit about some of those myths?
Sure, that's absolutely right. We took a look at about 75 unique studies from 50 different sources that were published over the last 10 years. We really wanted to make sure that we were building on a lot of the great research that's already been done in the field. And the idea was to take a good look at that research and understand what's the current state of our understanding about this community. And what we learned was, again, to your point, Bryan, that a lot of the long-standing myths about the community simply are not supported by the data. For example, some people might be surprised to know that LGBT people live just about everywhere in the country, not just in major metropolitan areas. The Williams Institute actually did an analysis of U.S. Census data and found that same-sex couples reside in 93% of the counties across the country. Another long-standing myth in some circles is that this is a purely affluent community. But again, the data simply doesn't support that conclusion. A number of data points that I could share. The Williams Institute did another analysis and found that same-sex couples who are raising children make on average about $10,000 less than different-sex couples who are raising children. And actually 1 in 3 LGBT people reported at some point in their lives not having enough money to be able to buy food. And poverty simply isn't an issue that's usually associated with this community.
Moving on from the research phase, can we talk a little bit about the interactive phase where people actually talked about what their hopes were? Can you characterize the range of hopes in some way?
Sure. Not surprising, the term equality was the most prominent term that appeared across the hopes from LGBT people across America. But what we did find somewhat surprising was the range in which people defined and understood that term in their lives. There were 2 broad ideas that we saw popping through. The first was this notion of legal equality, so laws and policies. But what was clear was that people were interested in legal equality beyond marriage issues. They'd bring up a range of topics like workplace concerns, immigration, racial justice, economic inequality, healthcare, and then a bunch of issues that really are specific to the trans community. And then in that second bucket around social acceptance, people used equality to describe full equality in their lived lives, so being treated equally and fairly in their everyday experiences. And they talk specifically about that in their families, in their workplaces and schools, and also in their faith communities. Others might be surprised to know that a Pew study from 2013 found that 51% of LGBT adults actually do report some religious affiliation. And so concerns in that realm were really prominent.
This is something that struck me as somebody who lives and works in Washington, and it's all about policy and politics so much. While that legal equality, statutes and policies and so forth is certainly important to people, there's a lot more conversation about people's everyday lives. Most people are never going to take advantage of a civil rights law to go sue somebody for discriminating against them. They want acceptance in the places they live and work. And it really struck me, being, in a pretty privileged situation I live in here in DC, to hear so many people who are really yearning for those things in their daily lives. And it's a challenge for the movement, I think. That goes to human services, and what kind of community do we really have beyond the political and policy battles?
Mm-hmm. Another major topic that came up were actually trans issues. The term trans was consistently in the top 5 most commonly used words in the hopes, fears, and ideas from LGBT people from all walks of life across the country. It wasn't coming from one specific group. A bit more specifically, people were hoping that the movement would move toward addressing violence toward and also suicide among trans people. And then from the trans people who did participate in the campaign, we heard a range of hopes. That included being represented within the LGBT community. Inclusivity was a really prominent theme that we saw in the submissions. Also, the needs of trans people who've been incarcerated. The National Transgender Discrimination Survey actually found that 16% of trans adults have been imprisoned at some point in their lives. And so hopes unique to that community were very prominent in the submissions we saw from across the country. A couple other issues that trans people mentioned in terms of their hopes were having access to healthcare, but also making sure they wouldn't be discriminated against by their healthcare providers, which was particularly of concern among seniors in that community. And then also employment and housing. So being able to find and keep your house, your home, your apartment, regardless of gender identity.
Well, getting back to the context of despair, what were, can you characterize the fears?
I've got that. It was interesting because so much of the public conversation about this community in recent years has been about winning, right? Winning over public opinion around marriage equality, winning battles at the ballot box and the courts. But the big theme we saw when we asked people, what are your fears? We kept hearing people talk about loss. And there was a number of ways they were talking about loss. One was related to the former. A lot of people are concerned about political backlash and losing what we've gained, so recently gained, and specifically mentioning Republicans and conservatives. Some people would say their only word they wrote when we asked what was your fear was Republicans. There's that political dialogue, right? But it's interesting. You see what's going on with Donald Trump right now, right? This political dialogue that people go out there and say on TV, it scares people who feel that their lives are in danger in some way, or their rights are in danger. It's a real fear people have, driven by that kind of political dialogue. And of course, those of you who follow these things know that in the city of Houston, we just lost a non-discrimination ordinance because of political backlash in which the other side vilified trans people to try to take away rights. Nicholle and I've been working with some other projects looking at the conversation on LGBT issues in conservative states, and that's exactly what we see there too. There's political backlash. It's happening right now. And the movement really, frankly, is not prepared to deal with it, to lay out that sort of sense of reality. We have a lot of work to do. And it's not just this movement, as you said. We can win big battles like we did in the Supreme Court. Good luck, right? The battle, that's just one phase. It's an early win, and this is a struggle that keeps going on. Other ones I wanted to make sure to mention, people afraid of losing their jobs or their housing due to discrimination, which is interesting, starting to work in this movement 20 years ago. That was sort of top of mind for people. It's been in the background as we've talked about marriage, but those are serious concerns to people. Most Americans either do not know or do not believe that federal civil rights laws don't prohibit that kind of discrimination. So I think we've got work to do in educating people and obviously moving forward non-discrimination protections in lots of states and here in Congress. Starkly, people talked about fear of losing their lives or the lives of their friends of loved ones through violence or suicide. Of course, we see that as a common fear. The Pew Research in a study in 2013 found nearly 1 in 3 LGBT people said they'd been physically attacked or threatened in their life. And I'd say HIV was also fairly prominent as a fear, but we saw a difference. Younger people talking about HIV were fearful of its spread through their community, and older people talking about fears of aging with HIV and being able to live a healthy life as they age. And finally, we saw a theme of fear of social isolation. People fearful of losing loved ones or what community they have due to a lack of acceptance. So it's sort of the other side of the coin of these hopes, but there's clearly a lot of unfinished business.
Well, in the last minute or so remaining, I guess it makes sense to end, and let's hear about some of the solutions people were putting on the table.
Absolutely. There were a range of ideas put on the table, but education was clearly what people saw as the key to a better tomorrow. And they meant that in 2 broad ways. It was education within the LGBT community, again, this idea of inclusivity, but also education of the broader society. And they'd often, again, submit these one-word responses of education as their idea for the future. But when they did elaborate, they were really focused on our schools. And some specific ideas that came up in that conversation were training for school counselors so that they can handle and address LGBT issues that arise in schools, expanding and enhancing our school curriculum so that it honestly and accurately addresses the realities of human sexuality and all of its diversity. We know from the research that children begin identifying their gender identity between the ages of 3 and 6. And then diversity training in the workplace, and again for healthcare providers, as that was such a critical concern. And then secondarily, community. That notion was a very prominent idea that came up, and it, again, was meant in 2 ways, both making the community itself for LGBT people more inclusive and offering a real community of support when people need it, when they're down. And there were a lot of specific ideas in that vein that you can take a look at sharetomorrow.org.
Thank you all for honoring the importance of this public conversation. We're so glad to be here with you. Thank you.